A dramatic change in transportation is underway in America. It will impact the U.S. corn crop. Three forces are quietly reshaping energy demand in this country: the sale of new electric vehicles, the rise of EV robotaxis, and drone deliveries are reducing everyday driving. The impact on corn farmers and ethanol producers is small currently, but beyond 2030 the impact is likely to be significant. Today, 36% of the U.S. corn crop goes to produce ethanol. That ethanol ends up blended into the gasoline that powers internal combustion vehicles across the country. By 2030, the transportation transition will conservatively displace somewhere between 3.5 and 4 million acres of the corn crop. In the period from 2031 to 2035, the impact gets larger as robotaxis and drone deliveries move from startup phase into mainstream services. Prior to delving into corn, it helps to understand the broader energy picture. Between 2021 and 2025, U.S. gasoline demand only grew by 1%. Electric power demand, however, grew by nearly 8% over the same period. What's driving that electricity demand? Data centers running 24/7 to power the AI revolution. Industrial and manufacturing coming back to the U.S. Fleet electrification of delivery vans and municipal buses. And more EVs on the road every year. The gasoline market is stagnating while electricity demand is surging. That divergence is the backdrop for this report. To really appreciate where we are today, you have to go back 20 years to 2005. The U.S. energy situation was bleak. Oil production had been in a 40-year decline since its peak in 1970. Natural gas production had sunk to a 16-year low. And ethanol, which today is a massive industry, was consuming only 15% of the corn crop and wasn't even part of the mainstream energy conversation. The country was in an energy crisis, and the outlook was more of the same. The low point in the U.S. energy crisis was 2005, but it was also the turning point. The Energy Policy Act of 2005 was passed mandating the blending of corn-based ethanol into gasoline. 2 to 3 years later, fracking technology was introduced into new natural gas wells, and the technology was applied to new oil wells a few years later. The production of natural gas, oil, and ethanol embarked on a production boom propelled by public policy and U.S. innovation and technology. Natural gas is an example of how dramatically things change. In 2005, natural gas production was stuck around 1.5 trillion cubic feet and wasn't growing to meet demand. Then fracking arrived. The technology unlocked vast reserves previously uneconomical to extract. By December of 2025, U.S. natural gas production was more than double the 2005 low. And today, the U.S. is the world's largest exporter of natural gas. The oil story is even more dramatic. U.S. crude oil production peaked in 1970 and then declined steadily for 40 years to a low around 2010. Every energy expert believed the situation was permanent and irreversible. Then fracking arrived in the oil patch around 2010 and completely changed the outlook. Production exploded upward, and the U.S. is now the largest oil producer in the world. The lesson here is important. Technology can change the trajectory of an entire industry almost overnight. We'll come back to that idea when we talk about robotaxis. In 2003, the U.S. was producing around 70 million barrels of ethanol annually. Then the Energy Policy Act of 2005 kicked in and production took off almost vertically. By 2011, the industry had grown to over 300 million barrels a year. There was a dip during COVID in 2020 and 2021 when people simply stopped driving. But production recovered, and in 2025, the U.S. hit a record high of 357 million barrels. Two things drove that record: higher refinery yields as the technology improved, and greater availability of E85 at gas stations, particularly in Corn Belt states and California. So how did ethanol go from a minor footnote in 2005 to consuming 36% of the corn crop today? The answer is government policy. The Energy Policy Act of 2005 mandated that gasoline sold in the U.S. contain a minimum volume of renewable fuel, primarily ethanol, and set a target of 7.5 billion gallons by 2012. Congress passed this law because they believed U.S. fossil fuel production was in permanent, irreversible decline. They were worried about record oil import dependence, volatile and rising energy prices, and the post-9/11 anxiety about depending on Middle Eastern oil. Ethanol from corn was seen as a domestic, renewable solution to an energy crisis. What nobody anticipated was that fracking would solve the fossil fuel problem, and that a new technology disruption, this time in transportation, would eventually put pressure on ethanol demand from the other direction. Before we get into the threats to ethanol demand, let's review the basic chain from cornfield to gas pump. It's a three-step process. Step 1, corn is harvested. Step 2, that corn goes to one of approximately 200 ethanol plants concentrated primarily in the Corn Belt, where it's converted into ethanol. Step 3, that ethanol gets blended into the gasoline supply and is provided at your local gas station as E10, which is 10% ethanol, and E85, which is 15% ethanol. Every time an American fills up their gas tank with regular gasoline, they're almost certainly burning corn ethanol. That's the connection this report is all about. And it's the connection that gets disrupted when vehicles shift from gasoline to electric power. The shift in how corn gets used in this country has been dramatic over the past 2 decades, and it happened in 3 distinct phases. Prior to 2005, less than 15% of the corn crop went to ethanol. It was a minor use. The 3 main uses of corn were for livestock feed, exports, and food processing. Then came a pivotal year, 2007, when the renewable fuel standard was expanded, mandating higher volumes of renewable fuel in gasoline. Ethanol demand essentially skyrocketed in response to that mandate. And then around 2011, something significant happened. For the first time ever, ethanol surpassed direct livestock feed use as the primary destination for U.S. corn. It has stayed that way ever since. Think about that for a moment. The single biggest use of the American corn crop today is not feeding animals or feeding people. It's making fuel. That fact is central to understanding why the transportation transition matters so much to corn farmers. Let's put some current numbers around this. In 2025, American farmers planted 98.8 million acres of corn and harvested a record 17.2 billion bushels. The total value of that crop was estimated at $72 billion, making corn one of the most valuable agricultural commodities in the world. Now here's what happens to all that corn. Approximately 5.6 billion bushels to ethanol production, 6 for animal feed, 2.6 for exports, and 3 went into storage and food and industrial use. 5 states produce over 50% of the U.S. corn crop: Iowa, Illinois, Nebraska, Minnesota, and Indiana. We'll come back to those 5 states because they're central to the geographic story we're telling. Key fact about where the ethanol industry stands today. Record U.S. production of 16.49 billion gallons in 2025. On the domestic side, demand rose to 14.3 billion gallons. Record exports of 2.18 billion gallons. Demand for U.S. ethanol is strong globally, with the national blend rate climbing to 10.51%, driven by greater availability of E85 and strong demand in Corn Belt states and California. Now here's a geographic concentration worth noting. Most of the approximately 200 U.S. ethanol plants are concentrated in 3 Corn Belt states. Iowa leads with 27% of national production. Nebraska accounts for 13%, and Illinois contributes 10%. So Iowa, Nebraska, and Illinois alone produce half of all U.S. ethanol. When we talk about displacement of corn acreage, these 3 states will feel it first and feel it hardest. This slide puts the corn ethanol story in energy perspective. A striking visual. Look at this map. The pink area in West Texas and southeastern New Mexico is the Permian Basin, 86,000 square miles. The gray area covering those 5 Corn Belt states, Iowa, Illinois, Nebraska, Minnesota, and Indiana, is 305,000 square miles. The Permian Basin is a fraction of the size of the Corn Belt. Yet here's the energy comparison. The Permian Basin produces 6.6 million barrels of oil per day. Those 5 Corn Belt states produce the equivalent of roughly 400,000 barrels per day from ethanol. The ratio is 16.5 to 1. One relatively small geological formation in West Texas produces 16.5 times more energy than nearly half the entire U.S. corn crop spread across 5 large Midwestern states. That contrast is not a criticism of ethanol. It's simply a statement of energy density reality that helps frame the scale of what we're talking about. So let's close the loop on the historical context. In 2005, the U.S. was in an energy crisis. By 2025, just 20 years later, the picture is completely transformed. The U.S. is now the world's largest oil producer. The U.S. has been the world's largest producer of natural gas since 2009 and is now the world's largest exporter of LNG. And ethanol production has quadrupled from 3.9 billion gallons in 2005 to 16 billion gallons in 2025. What made all of this possible? 2 things: innovation in the form of fracking and American capital that funded the build-out at massive scale. Innovation plus capital transforming an entire energy sector in 20 years, because that's exactly the dynamic now playing out in transportation. Except this time the innovation is autonomous electric vehicles and drones, and the capital is flowing in from Tesla, Amazon, and Walmart. And this time the disruption runs in the opposite direction for ethanol. Now for the heart of the report. Let's start with the most straightforward of the 3 forces: the sale of new electric vehicles. The connection to corn is direct. 36% of the U.S. corn crop in the form of ethanol ends up in the gas tanks of internal combustion vehicles. Every new EV sold replaces a gas-powered car. There is a straight line from EV sales to corn acreage. The U.S. lags well behind China and Europe in the transition to EVs, and there are structural reasons for that. SUVs and trucks make up a significant portion of the U.S. market. There are currently no price-competitive EV alternatives for those segments. U.S. EV assembly capacity is limited, and tariffs prevent Chinese EVs from flooding the market, which would actually accelerate the transition, but would also push U.S. legacy auto companies to the brink. So the EV transition in America is real, but it's slower than what we're seeing globally. This chart makes the global disparity very clear. In 2025, China sold 13.7 million new EVs. Europe sold 3.6 million. The United States sold 1.28 million, less than 10% of China's volume. Despite government incentives in all 3 markets, the U.S. significantly lags. Now, why does this matter for our analysis? Because it tells us that EV displacement of gasoline demand, and therefore ethanol demand, is going to be slower in the U.S. than the global headlines suggest. The U.S. is a truck and SUV market. The under $30,000 EV segment barely exists here. And the legacy automakers who dominate those segments have been losing billions on their EV programs and are pulling back. That's actually important context for our corn acreage displacement estimates. EVs are a real factor, but a modest one through 2030 in the U.S. This slide gives us both the current market share picture and a preview of where the U.S. could eventually go. On the left, market share of new EV car sales in 2025. Norway leads the world at 97%. China is at 53%. Europe at 17%. And the U.S. at 9%. 9% is meaningful progress from where we were 5 years ago, but it's a long way from Norway. Now look at what Norway's EV adoption has done to gasoline demand on the right side of this slide. From 2016 to 2023, Norway's gasoline consumption dropped 22%. That is a direct result of EVs replacing gas-powered cars at scale. Norway is essentially the laboratory experiment that shows us where high EV adoption leads. Who is actually selling EVs in America? Tesla absolutely dominates the U.S. EV market. The Model Y was the top-selling EV in 2025 with 357,000 units. The Model 3 sold nearly 190,000. Combined, Tesla sold 589,000 EVs in the U.S. in 2025, nearly half the entire U.S. EV market by itself. General Motors was a distant second at 170,000, led by the Chevy Equinox EV. Ford sold 84,000, primarily the Mustang Mach-E. The Hyundai Ioniq 5 rounds out the top 5. The EV market in America right now is essentially Tesla, with everyone else fighting over the remainder. That market structure matters enormously when we get to the robotaxi chapter, because Tesla isn't just selling EVs, they're building towards something much larger. Two critical facts for understanding why EV displacement of gasoline is slower in the US than anywhere else. First, SUVs and trucks make up 80% of the US new car market. There are currently no price-competitive EVs for the truck segment and very limited options for large SUVs. The buyers of F-150s and Silverados and Ram trucks, which are consistently the top 3 selling vehicles in America, have essentially no EV alternative at a comparable price point. Second, and this is a number that doesn't get enough attention, 10% of U.S. drivers consume approximately 35% of all U.S. gasoline. These are what you might call super mileage drivers, people living in less populated areas who typically drive older trucks long distances. EVs are not reaching these drivers. Charging infrastructure doesn't serve them. The economics don't work for them. So even as EV sales grow, that 35% of gasoline consumption is largely protected from EV displacement through 2030. Production capacity is a constraint on how fast the U.S. EV transition can actually happen. Tesla's U.S. production capacity is approximately 1.5 million vehicles annually. That makes Tesla by far the largest EV manufacturer in America. The legacy companies, Ford and GM, have lost billions of dollars trying to build out EV production, and both have pulled back from EV commitments. They're caught between their profitable truck and SUV businesses and an EV transition they can't yet make money on. Now here's the geopolitical dimension. China has approximately 75% of global EV production capacity. The U.S. currently imposes a 100% tariff on Chinese EVs. That tariff is essentially a wall protecting Ford, GM, and the U.S. auto industry from being overwhelmed. If that wall ever comes down, the dynamics change dramatically. The threat from Chinese EVs is real. CEOs of the world's major automakers have stated so publicly. Toyota's CEO Koji Sato stated in March of 2026, "Unless things change, we will not survive." I want everyone to acknowledge this sense of crisis. Ford CEO Jim Farley told CBS Sunday Morning that China has enough production capacity with existing factories to serve the entire North American market and put every U.S. automaker out of business. And Honda CEO, after touring an auto supplier factory in Shanghai, said simply, "We have no chance against this." These are the chief executives of 3 of the world's largest automakers describing a competitive threat. The tariff wall is currently protecting them. But it also means the U.S. EV transition is slower than it would otherwise be, which has direct implications for our corn acreage displacement estimates. Ford did something remarkable a few years ago. They bought a Tesla, took it apart, and studied every component. CEO Jim Farley reported the findings publicly, and they were sobering for the legacy auto industry. Tesla has roughly 1,600 fewer parts than a comparable Ford EV. Fewer welds, fewer connectors, fewer potential failure points. Tesla's gigacasting technology, where entire front and rear underbody sections are cast as single large pieces, is something Ford and GM are years behind on. And Tesla uses about 1 mile less wiring than a Mustang Mach-E. That's roughly 70 pounds of copper wire that Tesla doesn't need. Farley's conclusion: this is not a styling gap or a software gap. It's a fundamental manufacturing cost gap that's very hard to close quickly. This manufacturing advantage is exactly why Tesla can price the Cybercab at $25,000 while Waymo's vehicle costs over $100,000. We'll come back to that comparison in a moment. Now let's quantify what current and projected EV sales actually mean for corn acreage. The logic is straightforward. Every EV on the road replaces a gas-powered car. That gas-powered car would have consumed gasoline blended with 10% ethanol. There are currently about 4 million EVs on U.S. roads. At average driving patterns, those 4 million EVs displace approximately 422,000 acres of corn, about 0.46% of the total corn crop. Now, if we project forward and assume 1.5 million new EVs are sold annually from 2026 through 2030, by 2030, there will be approximately 10 million EVs on U.S. roads. At that point, the displacement grows to 1.1 million acres, about 1.2% of the corn crop. So EVs alone through 2030 displace slightly over 1% of U.S. corn acreage. Real but modest. The bigger story is what comes next. The scale of the robo-taxi opportunity is not a secret in the industry. Uber's CEO Dara Khosrowshahi said recently in an interview that robo-taxis are a $1 trillion-plus opportunity. Let me put that in perspective. The entire U.S. new car market was $620 billion in 2025. The entire U.S. corn crop was worth $72 billion. The Uber CEO is describing a robo-taxi market that could eventually be larger than the U.S. new car market. He also made the point that autonomous rides unlock more demand as you lower costs. In other words, it's not just replacing existing rides. It creates entirely new transportation behavior as prices drop. And he noted that robo-taxi is a platform for all kinds of services, many of which haven't even been conceived yet. A $1 trillion market being built on top of infrastructure that currently consumes billions of gallons of ethanol annually. That's the disruption we're measuring. This is where the analysis gets genuinely interesting. The U.S. ride-hailing market in 2025 is enormous. 18 billion rides and 60 billion miles driven annually. About 90% of those rides today is in a gas-powered vehicle driven by a human driver. Over the next 5 years, that is going to change fundamentally. Ride-hailing is transitioning from human-driven gas-powered vehicles to driverless electric vehicles. Tesla is entering this market with a newly designed two-seat self-driving EV, the Cybercab, built from the ground up for autonomous operation with no steering wheel and no pedals. When that transition happens, and it is happening, the ethanol that currently gets burned in all those ride-hailing miles disappears from demand. 60 billion miles a year is a significant number. At average fuel economy, that's a lot of gasoline, and 10% of that gasoline is ethanol, and that ethanol comes from corn. The ride-hailing transition from gas to electric is the single largest threat to ethanol demand in this report. Let's look at the current players and their scale. Uber dominates with 13.6 billion rides and 55 billion miles in 2025. Lyft is a distant second with 945 million rides and about 4.8 billion miles. Waymo, the Google autonomous vehicle spinoff, completed 14 million rides and about 59 million miles. And DoorDash handled 3.2 billion deliveries. Here's the critical context. All of this ride-hailing activity combined accounts for less than 2% of the 3.3 trillion miles driven annually in the U.S. Less than 2%. That means the vast majority of American driving is still personal vehicles making personal trips. The robo-taxi opportunity isn't just about capturing existing ride-hailing miles. It's about expanding into that other 98% of miles driven. That's what makes the $1 trillion projection plausible and what makes the long-term threat to gasoline and ethanol demand so significant. $111 billion in a single year. This is the difference between gross revenues and net revenues for Uber and Lyft combined. The vast majority of this number represents payment to Uber and Lyft drivers. It is a number larger than the U.S. 2025 corn crop. Now removing the driver eliminates the single largest cost in ride-hailing. When that driver payment disappears from the cost structure, the economics of transportation change completely. ARK Invest projects that autonomous rides could eventually drop to 25 cents per mile, compared to Uber's current cost of around $2 per mile, excluding tip. At 25 cents a mile, autonomous transportation becomes cheaper than owning a personal car. At that price point, demand doesn't just shift, it explodes. And every one of those miles that shifts from a gas-powered car to an electric robo-taxi is a mile that no longer consumes ethanol. Now let's translate the robo-taxi story into corn acreage numbers. This matrix shows 3 fleet sizes, 1 million, 2 million, and 4 million robo-taxis, against 3 annual mileage scenarios, 30,000, 45,000, and 60,000 miles per year per vehicle. Remember, these are electric vehicles replacing gas-powered ride-hailing cars. So every mile driven by Cybercab is a mile not driven in a gasoline-powered Uber or Lyft. At 1 million robo-taxis driving 45,000 miles per year, a reasonable mid-case, the displacement is approximately 352,000 acres of corn. At 2 million robot-taxis at 45,000 miles, which is achievable by 2029 based on the production ramp, the displacement is 705,000 acres, about 0.77% of the corn crop. At 4 million robo-taxis at 60,000 miles, the more aggressive longer-term scenario, displacement reaches 1.9 million acres, or over 2% of the corn crop. Combined with EV displacement of 1.1 million acres, you're already approaching the 3.5 to 4 million acre range in our summary conclusion. Let's put the revenue side of the robo-taxi equation on the table as well, because it helps explain why Tesla and every major technology investor is so focused on this market. At 1 million cybercabs driving 30,000 miles per year and charging $1 per mile, Tesla generates $30 billion in annual revenue from the robo-taxi network. At $2 per mile, that doubles to $60 billion. At 2 million vehicles and 45,000 miles per year at $2 per mile, $180 billion annually. For context, Tesla's total company revenue in 2024 was approximately $97 billion. The robo-taxi network alone at scale could generate more revenue than Tesla's entire current business. And remember, no driver payments, no gasoline. Tesla owns the charging network. The margin profile of this business is unlike anything in the history of transportation. Drone deliveries are the third force in our transportation transformation. Drone deliveries reduce 2 types of driving. First, personal trips to the store. When a Walmart drone delivers eggs or aspirin to your door, it eliminates a drive to Walmart. Second, last-mile delivery vehicle trips. When Amazon's drone delivers a package directly to your door, an Amazon delivery van doesn't have to make that stop. Both types of driving reduction mean less gasoline consumed, less ethanol blended, and less corn eated. The world's 2 largest retailers, Walmart and Amazon, are committed to this technology and are scaling it aggressively right now. The current drone technology is specifically designed around a weight limit of 5 pounds with a range of 5 to 8 miles. Walmart has stated that 50% of its inventory weighs 5 pounds or less. Amazon delivered 5.4 billion packages in 2025, and approximately 80% of those weighed less than 5 pounds. This is not a technology looking for a use case. The use case is the majority of what people buy every day. Walmart has drone delivery operating across 5 states, with key hubs in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, Atlanta, Houston, Orlando, Tampa, and Charlotte. Service will expand to 150 store locations by end of 2026, and by end of 2027, Walmart will have over 270 drone delivery locations reaching more than 40 million households, stretching from Los Angeles to Miami. Walmart has already completed over 1 million drone deliveries. Amazon Prime Air started in College Station, Texas, and is now operating in Dallas, San Antonio, Waco, and Kansas, Arizona, Michigan, Illinois, and Florida, with 10 new metro areas planned for 2026. Amazon's goal is 1 million drone deliveries by end of 2026 and 500 million deliveries by 2030. One important note on the Amazon side: pharmacy integration into their drone delivery system is expected to be a major volume driver. Prescription delivery by drone changes the frequency and urgency of the use case entirely. Walmart's 1 million cumulative deliveries represent the shift from experimental technology to reliable infrastructure. The scalability is now being proven by the high frequency of repeat users rather than just the total number of unique customers. The four most popular drone delivery items are eggs, rotisserie chicken, over-the-counter health items, and ice cream. Top 25% Walmart users average about 3 drone deliveries per week. 2 scenarios to determine the impact on corn for projected 2030 combined Amazon and Walmart drone deliveries. First, a conservative 500 million combined deliveries in 2030, using 7.5 miles per displaced trip at 22.5 miles per gallon and the 10.2% ethanol blend. The corn acreage displacement is approximately 39,000 acres, 0.04% of the corn crop. Second, an aggressive 1 billion deliveries showing displacement doubles to 78,000 acres, 0.09%. These are very small numbers. Drones are real, they're growing fast, and 2 of the world's largest companies are committed to them. But as an ethanol displacement force through 2030, they are a minor contributor. The significance of drones is not their 2030 ethanol impact. It's the behavioral shift they represent and the trajectory they establish for 2031 to 2035 as volumes scale into the billions. Tesla is creating a platform that at scale may reduce the cost of ride-hailing to just 25 cents per mile, less than the cost of owning and operating a personal car. That's the ARK Invest projection. And if they're right, it means exponential growth in ride-hailing demand that transforms American transportation. Compared to that potential, the impact of new EV sales and drone deliveries on ethanol demand is modest. Ride-hailing is where the real disruption lives. And when you look at the 2031 to 2035 period, when the Cybercab fleet is fully deployed, when the cost curve is played out, and when autonomous ride-hailing has become a normal everyday service, the displacement of corn ethanol acreage is likely to exceed 5%. That's not a crisis for American agriculture today, but it is a structural shift that corn farmers and ethanol producers need to see coming. And now you have. The U.S. agricultural industry and Corn Belt politicians are well aware of the threat posed by EVs. The recent tax bill contained a section providing the potential for increased ethanol usage in aviation fuel. E85 is growing in popularity, especially in the Corn Belt. Vale, a Brazilian mining company, signed an agreement to build 2 large ships to be run on ethanol in June 2026. Brazil is the second largest ethanol producer in the world. The weekend of June 13th and 14th, I took 3 Tesla Cybercab rides in Palo Alto, California. The technology worked. The experience was seamless. The wait time was 20 minutes, a number that shrinks dramatically as the fleet scales. The future this report describes is not theoretical. It is already on the road.